It's noon in the Valley of the Kings. The sun is directly overhead. The sand is hot enough to blister bare feet in seconds, and somewhere below your line of sight, a crew of tomb builders is about to clock in for a full day of manual labor. No sunscreen, no sunglasses, no air conditioning, no cold water bottle sweating condensation in a cup holder. Just skin, stone, and a sun that doesn't negotiate. And yet these people didn't just survive the hottest, driest environment on the planet. They thrived in it. They built an empire that lasted 3,000 years, longer than the gap between us and them, in a place where modern hikers still die of heatstroke every single year. So here's the real question. It's not how did they survive the heat. It's what did they figure out about the human body thousands of years before we had the word dermatology that we're still catching up to? Because a lot of what looks like ancient superstition, the black eyeliner, the white linen, the midday disappearing act, turns out to be some of the smartest heat survival engineering humans have ever invented. And some of it they got from watching the desert itself. Let's start with the fact that ancient Egyptians were dealing with heat stress from the very beginning of their civilization, because the Nile Valley didn't get less brutal as history rolled on. If anything, the surrounding Sahara was drying out and closing in. Archaeologists working at pre-dynastic sites along the Nile have found early Egyptian burials with linen wrappings dating back over 5,000 years, long before pyramids, long before pharaohs had names we remember. That's not decoration. Linen, made from flax, is one of the most breathable fibers available to the ancient world. It wicks sweat, it doesn't trap heat against skin the way wool does, and it dries fast. These early Nile Valley communities were already dressing for the climate before they had writing to explain why. Here's the plain English version. Thousands of years before moisture-wicking fabric was a marketing term on an REI tag, people living in one of the hottest floodplains on Earth had already worked out by trial and error which fiber kept a body from cooking itself alive. But here's where it gets interesting. Flax isn't native to true desert conditions. It needs the Nile's annual flood to grow at all, which means Egyptian heat survival wasn't really about surviving the desert. It was about survival at the exact seam where desert and river collide, and every technology they built came from exploiting that seam. Now let's talk about why the human body even needs help in the first place, because here's the thing nobody tells you, humans are actually one of the best heat-dumping animals on the planet. We just don't feel like it's standing in the Egyptian sun. Humans have an unusually high density of sweat glands compared to almost every other mammal, and unlike a dog panting or a horse lathering, human sweat evaporates efficiently off mostly bare skin. Evolutionary biologists studying human origins in hot African savannas have connected this trait directly to our ancestors' need to run and hunt in daytime heat when other predators were resting. We are, biologically speaking, built to outsweat almost anything else alive. But sweating that efficiently comes with a cost, water and salt loss. And in a landscape where water only exists in one long green ribbon through an ocean of sand, that biological gift becomes a countdown clock. So the real ancient Egyptian survival story isn't fighting their biology, it's working with it. Every cultural adaptation, the clothing, the architecture, the schedule of the day, exists to protect that one incredible built-in cooling system long enough for it to do its job without draining the body dry. Turns out evolution gave humans the engine. Egypt just had to keep it fueled. Here's where the evidence stops being about accidental survival and starts showing deliberate, engineered decisions. And the clearest example is coal. That thick black eyeliner painted around the eyes of nearly every pharaoh, noble, worker, and child depicted in Egyptian art wasn't just a beauty standard. Chemical analysis of surviving coal residues from Egyptian tombs has shown the cosmetic was made from ground galena and other lead-based minerals, and researchers studying these formulations have found the compounds have antibacterial properties useful for preventing eye infections in a dusty, fly-heavy environment. On top of that, the dark pigment around the eyes functioned almost exactly like the black grease modern athletes smear under their eyes, cutting glare bouncing off blinding white sand and reflective limestone buildings. This wasn't just pharaoh vanity. Workers at desert labor sites, including the well-documented artisan community of Deir el-Medina, wore it too. That's intentional, widespread, cross-class adoption of a specific technology for a specific environmental problem. But here's the twist. They may not have fully understood the antibacterial chemistry the way we do now. They understood results. Eyes that got coal stayed healthier. Eyes that didn't got infected more. That's not modern medicine. That's several thousand years of quiet, brutal trial and error, distilled into a cosmetic ritual everyone just kept doing because it worked. Now, here's where we have to be careful, because there's a gap in this story, and it's worth sitting with instead of rushing past. We don't have direct evidence of the very first heat survival strategies ancient Egyptians ever tried, and we probably never will. Early shelter, early clothing, early sun protection, these were built from organic material. Reed matting, animal hide, unfired mud. In a hot, sometimes humid floodplain environment, organic material simply doesn't survive thousands of years the way stone or gold does. What we're left with is a record heavily skewed toward tombs, because tombs were built to last forever, and everyday life mostly wasn't. So when we talk about the earliest evidence of a heat adaptation, what we usually mean is the earliest evidence that happened to survive, not the earliest one that existed. Evidence from multiple pre-dynastic and early dynastic sites suggests these survival behaviors were already well established by the time anyone thought to paint them on a wall or bury them with the dead. The real beginning of Egyptian heat survival technology is invisible to us. It rotted, burned, or blew away centuries before anyone with a shovel showed up to look for it. For a long time, one detail from ancient writing about Egypt got treated as exaggeration, until archaeology proved otherwise. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described Egyptian daily life in detail, including habits and customs that struck outsiders as strange. For centuries, some later European scholars treated parts of his account of Egypt with skepticism, assuming a Greek tourist had embellished what he saw. But excavation after excavation, from tomb inscriptions to worker settlements, has repeatedly confirmed core elements of daily Egyptian life that Herodotus described from the outside as an observer, including the rhythms of work, rest, and river life dictated entirely by the sun and the Nile cycle. Here's the honest answer. Herodotus wasn't a perfect source, and historians still argue over which specific details he got right versus embellished. But the broader picture, a civilization that organized its entire day around avoiding peak heat and maximizing the cool hours near the river, has held up remarkably well against the physical evidence. Sometimes the unreliable ancient tourist turns out to have been paying closer attention than the skeptics gave him credit for. Here's the thing that makes this bigger than just an Egypt story. The same core strategies show up independently in hot climates that had zero contact with the Nile Valley. Look at traditional desert and hot climate communities across the historical record, from Bedouin populations in the Arabian Desert to indigenous communities in the American Southwest to traditional dress across the Sahel. Loose, light-colored, breathable clothing that traps a thin layer of cooler air against skin instead of pressing tight against it shows up again and again in cultures with no shared origin. Thick-walled, small-windowed architecture that keeps interior spaces cool through thermal mass shows up from Egyptian mud-brick homes to traditional adobe structures continents away. This is where it stops being an Egyptian trick and starts being a universal human answer to a universal human problem. Different climates, different centuries, different continents, same solution, arrived at independently. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when a species with the same biology keeps running into the same enemy, the sun, and keeps figuring out the same handful of ways to beat it. So let's get cold and practical for a second, because behind every one of these customs is brutal survival math. Ancient Egyptian daily schedules, as reconstructed from tomb records and worker documentation at sites like Deir el-Medina, show labor concentrated in the cooler morning and late afternoon hours, with a break during the most punishing midday heat. That's not laziness. That's thermoregulation. Working through peak sun in a desert climate dramatically increases the risk of heat exhaustion and death, something modern military and endurance sport researchers have quantified in painstaking detail, and something Egyptian laborers clearly understood without a single thermometer. Mud brick construction, meanwhile, wasn't chosen just because it was cheap and available. Thick mud walls have high thermal mass, meaning they absorb heat slowly during the day and release it slowly at night, keeping interior spaces significantly cooler than the outside air during peak hours. And the Nile itself functioned as the ultimate cooling and hydration infrastructure. Settlements clustered along it not just for farming, but because proximity to water was, quite literally, the difference between a functioning nervous system and a fatal one. Every piece of this, the clothing, the architecture, the schedule, was survival engineering disguised as tradition. But here's the uncomfortable part, because not everyone in ancient Egypt got to follow this wisdom. The same tomb and labor records that show a rest period during peak heat also show that this protection wasn't distributed equally. Construction crews building royal monuments and quarrying stone in the open desert. Jobs disproportionately filled by lower status laborers, and at various points in Egyptian history, conscripted or forced workers, were pushed far harder in dangerous heat than the elite ever were. Medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents in the world, include treatments connected to heat-related ailments and exhaustion, which tells us plainly enough that heat sickness among workers was common enough to require standard remedies. So the wisdom was real. The Egyptians understood heat survival better than almost any civilization of their time. But like so much ancient knowledge, it functioned less like a universal right and more like a resource, protected carefully for those who mattered to the state, and rationed out thinly for those doing the actual backbreaking work that built the monuments we still marvel at today. The pyramids weren't just built with stone and sweat. They were built on an unequal distribution of exactly the survival knowledge that could have saved more lives. So here's what we actually know. Ancient Egyptians survived one of the harshest climates on Earth not through luck, but through a deep, practical understanding of their own biology, refined over thousands of years and encoded into clothing, architecture, medicine, and the rhythm of the day itself. And maybe that's the real reframe here. Civilization isn't just pyramids and gold. Civilization is a species slowly learning how to keep its own body alive against an environment that would otherwise kill it. One linen wrap, one coal-lined eye, one mud brick wall at a time. Think about it. The breathable linen from those pre-dynastic Nile burials. The coal that doubled as glare protection and infection control. Herodotus, doubted for centuries, turning out to be more accurate than his critics. The Ebers Papyrus, quietly documenting heat sickness in workers the empire didn't always protect. Every one of those details is a fragment of the same fight, the fight to keep a human body cool enough to keep functioning under a merciless sun. And you're still fighting it. Every time you reach for a light-colored shirt in summer, every time you seek shade at noon instead of full sun, every time your body breaks into a sweat you don't even think about. That's the same ancient engine the Egyptians spent 3,000 years learning to protect. The desert never got easier. We just got smarter at surviving it.